Welcome to the Raffles Crew Podcast. And I have enormous pleasure in introducing my guest, Gary Dugan, who is a global expert on markets and who has agreed to talk to us today. What's going on with US tariffs? How should we interpret them? What's the reason for them? And what potentially are the impacts in the medium term? And for context, I'm sitting here in Singapore where I advise a range of companies who are widely invested in the Asia Pacific markets, all the way down from Australia up to Northern Asia. And Gary, you're based in the Middle East, but I guess you have a similar purview. Is your purview global, would you say?
Absolutely. I sit in the middle of the world here in Dubai.
So Gary, I should say, is the CEO of the CIO Office, which sounds a lot grander than me, but because he is grand, although humble. And today I will pick his brain on these massively important topics to which no one has a precise answer. It'd be fair to say that everyone's suffering from a little bit of trauma, and as background to this, I have a number of business networks which I chair, and over the last couple of weeks, I've been lambasted by men of my age, and as you can probably gather, I'm slightly over 40. Men of my age who have got substantial amounts of money invested in equities, and who from one day to the next have found themselves sort of 15% poorer, and that's made them rather grumpy. Speaking as an impecunious farmer whose money is invested in vintage tractors, I'm absolutely delighted. I see every possibility of increments on the vintage tractor market as people start to go to more solid investments. So cutting straight to it, I think it would be helpful if we just forget Trump, who seems to trigger everybody, Gary. What can we talk a little bit about the background? What's China been up to? Um, is it appropriate to use the word mercantilism about what they've been doing? And how have they been manipulating global trade? Can you help us understand that? Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. There is so much going on, and I think we've just got to try and simplify it for people. And you've opened with a good question, because whatever's happened in the last 3 or 4 months has to be seen in the context of things that have developed over the last 10 years. And I'm not going to make one profound statement to start with, is that China's got bigger. There's enough books written about it that at some stage it would be the clash of the titans, when America kind of wakes up and says, wow, we've got a real competitor. So the first stage of that kind of competitiveness is that China got bigger in terms of GDP, its share of global GDP, let's just say in round numbers, 20%, but there's many ways of measuring it. But the second element is that, if it was China still producing cheap plastic goods, which are good for toys at Christmas, that's fine. We can cope with that. But this is China now being a very effective competitor in a number of industries that the US thought were their own. And I think the DeepSeek event, which we had just a few months ago, when the world woke up to a cheaper way of getting ChatGPT and a Chinese way, which seemed to be far more effective. That and many other examples. This is what the world's woken up to. And unfortunately, the US sees this as now a significant risk.
Yes. And what's curious, and I mean, it might be worth talking about this a little bit. One of the reasons that the US is so divided is because there is a certain class in the US who has benefited enormously from the globalization, which has led to the increased power of China as a manufacturing hub, simply because Wall Street's sort of agnostic on what happens to working people in America. I mean, I would say my impression is that as long as they can make more money for the shareholders, and big companies have been making a lot of money, then it's not clear that they really care very much about the hollowing out of manufacturing industry in the US. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about that. So what's happened to cause that, Gary?
It's because of the price point that China has been producing. I give, the example that's often talked about is the iPhone, manufactured and assembled in China. And people had just not understood the scale. So it's only 2% of the products that Apple sell in the United States that are actually manufactured in the United States. Now, no one's complained up until we've got to 98% coming from China. The second point is, No one's understood the scale of what's been built in China and how it has been very effective. There is a manufacturing facility which employs 1 million people. So that's twice the population of Boston in producing iPhones, which then get sent to the United States at a price point which keeps people in a life that they've become accustomed, i.e., these very expensive products have been made a lot cheaper through mass production in China. So there are certain people and certain parts of our consumer group that are going to have enjoyed that cheap iPhone. But to your point, there's clearly been losers along the way, that those jobs didn't go to the US, largely because that they could be made cheaper in a big center of China.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to that because you chose the example of the iPhone, and I put it to you that it would be quite possible for Apple to still make a very handsome profit on their iPhones, even if they were substantially manufactured in America. If you look at the margins, it costs them cents on the dollar to make it in China, and they're selling it for what, $1,000 in some cases. Certainly, that's what they go for here. So let's come back to that. So my question on mercantilism. So this is what I was taught at school, when this was served up in the context of the then British Empire, since long gone, which is it's about a strategy of maximizing your exports and minimizing your imports by using any means you can, fair or foul. So currency manipulation, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, health and safety issues, a whole range of things. And would it be fair to say, and of course, egregiously not following treaties that you've actually signed, like the WTO, which China signed 25 years ago? Is that all true, or is that just something that Donald Trump made up?
I'm not going to answer it directly because I'm just going to put it into a very long historical perspective. That if you go back a long time in history, of course, the UK and France and the old nations dominated the world in terms of trade. And then comes, the noisy guy on the street corner, which happened to be the United States. And when you go back in history, what did the United States do? Well, it stole the technology. It put up massive tariff barriers in order that as a country, it could build its own industrial base and take on the rest of the world because it's
using intellectual property in many cases, which it had stolen from Europe, right?
Absolutely. So that doesn't mean what China has done is right, but they're only taken the playbook of the previous new guys that came onto the street. So I think it's wrong. It's just wrong to keep hammering the Chinese for actually doing things at the stage of their economic development, which are commensurate with what the United States did at that stage of their economic development some considerable time ago.
Right. Well, I agree. I mean, of course, nobody reads history anymore, so people might be quite surprised to hear what you just said. Surely we can agree that when they sign a WTO agreement, they should stick to it, or are we going to let them off that as well?
And no, we shouldn't be letting anyone. But it's a bit like the United States. The United States can change its mind on something or not comply with something because it's big, and I think that's where China now finds itself.
Yeah.
But I think that the difference over the last 6 months is that people have seen a China that's actually contributing to economic development and technology development in particular. There's a lot of things that have just come out recently, and particularly in the EV market. I'll give you some examples. Just one example, just to keep it brief. When we talk about is China contributing, if they're just stealing stuff and then reproducing it, that's not good. But if they're actually developing industries, and they're particularly developing industries in this greening of the world, the ESG space and the technology there, and particularly in electric vehicles, BYD since 2022 has produced 160 new models. Tesla has produced 6. So there is a dynamic to China's industrial base that wasn't there before. Yeah. It's not just a replication at a cheaper price.
Yeah. No, I don't think anyone look, I'm going to say some harsh things about China. It sounds as if you're going to be slightly more gentle, perhaps because you actually have clients in China. I don't know. Far be it from me to suggest something like that. Um, but the reality is, I've been going to China for 30 years. I've seen the changes that have gone on in China. Where half of Shanghai Pudong was a farm when I first went there at the beginning of the 90s. Now it's one of the leading industrial zones in the world.
Mm.
And new airports everywhere, new highways everywhere. Everyone's gone from literally riding a bicycle in 1990 when I went there. The whole of Shanghai, everyone was riding bicycles. To cars, to looking really good. So hats off to what China has been able to achieve. But coming back to to, um, to tariffs and to mercantilism, the advantage that China has managed to carve out is absolutely enormous. So a huge percentage of the world's manufacturing has moved to China because it's cheap, because they're versatile. And let's agree for the moment that because China's not the first country that started, as you said, you talked about America, but it's also true of Japan, it's also true of Korea. I can remember sitting in rooms at the beginning of my business career where people were projecting that Japan's economy was going to be the biggest economy in the world. And famously, they began by doing rather poor copies of Western designs of things. But then they very quickly started becoming extremely innovative in the area of cars, in the area of electronics, and so on and so forth. Same with Korea, right? So yeah, I agree. Fair enough. China's done all that. And they've also leveraged a few other things in order to increase their hegemony, which is that as their economy has grown and they are blessed with excess capacity, and for example, their ability to build houses, to build infrastructure, they've tried to export that capacity through something called Belt and Road, which you and I both talked about before. Um, could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, and there are definitely pluses and minuses around Belt and Road. I mean, they have created a captive audience by funding a lot of infrastructure. And people will argue that the conditions on that lending was punitive, that it was expensive, and it also tied these countries into allowing China to dominate their trade into the future.
Yeah,
But it's always a dilemma because if China didn't build it, who was going to? And
yeah,
if no one else was going to, it's a bit like saying, I will lend you some money and
yes,
I'm going to charge you 15%. And so that's too high. So, well, who else will lend you the money? So, there's always going to be plus and minus around this. But to be fair to China, they have committed, they have put the money in, they have built this infrastructure, and it has been, in general, beneficial to these countries.
yeah. And China has demonstrated amply, and I've been involved in projects which kind of prove this, that if you build the infrastructure ahead of the actual demand, you can actually generate demand.
Yeah.
That's overwhelmingly true in China. I was involved in a project where there was a non-existent city, but they had planned to build a city, to build roads, to build a high-speed railway. And I was working for a company that was going to build not one, but three enormous hotels at this junction. And by and large, it actually worked. 5 or 6 years later, the hotels were there, the people were there, the factories were there, the roads were there, and it was extremely profitable. You don't see that kind of planning and that kind of foresight elsewhere in the world, do you?
We do in Dubai, but they self-funded.
Nicely
So
played. Yeah.
I mean, when I came here in 2009 and they were building Dubai Mall, and I went around this vast empty building, you're thinking, who will ever come? Well, they eventually came because such an amazing facility was built. But it's the same in Sri Lanka or in any of these other countries that have benefited, and to some extent in Pakistan, that you put the capacity in, you enable the economic development of these regions, and all of a sudden you're going
Yeah.
to see greater vibrancy.
And one of the things that one of the areas in which I sometimes remonstrate with my American colleagues is, look, the US has pretty much had hegemony over the whole of Southeast Asia, if not the whole of Asia, since after the Second World War. After the Second World War, the US was everywhere, everyone else was broke. Had they chosen to, they could have been the leader in terms of building that infrastructure in Southeast Asia. But the reality is, and I think this is, I don't know if you agree with this, but this to me is a fact which is central to the way that America has allowed itself to be eclipsed by China, and that is the incredible short-termism of the American economic and political view. It's to do Firstly, with the political cycle, but secondly, with the fact that US companies measure their success on quarter by quarter. Chinese companies and to some extent other Asian companies have a much longer term view. The problem with that quarter to quarter view is you don't make long term bets. So you'll see very little US investment in infrastructure in Asia, for example. Where are the railways built by America? Where are the airports? Where are the ports? The answer is there aren't any, unless they've been built for military purposes and handed over. So to your point, these countries wanted the infrastructure, and China was ready to give it to them, and to give it to them without caveats. And the other thing that I've gone on about to some extent is that if you try, particularly in the last decade, if you try and sign a contract with a US company, there will be strictures in terms of the way that you handle people, in terms of things like gender and sexuality. Yes, that's right. And it's almost unbelievable when you actually look at some of these contracts, and I have looked at them, the degree to which a strange and foreign ideology has crept into American requirements when it comes to investing or lending money. I don't know whether you come across that, Gary, or are you?
Yes, absolutely. There's a heavy hand of, I go back to the point of culture. I mean,
Yeah,
actually, I was just reminded of a picture from, was it 8, 10, 12 years ago that I was at what's called the Kumbh Mela in India, which you think this is an eclectic, religious event where millions of people come. My abiding memory was seeing flags of Nivea and Lay's crisps across this whole mass of people. The dominance of US brands, which is something like 48% of all the major brands in the world, are American. So, again, I call it the clash of the titans. America got to this domination. China came along, and some others. I think India, again, are trying to push in there as well now and saying, no, you can't be 48%. We want you down to 35%. And now the US is pushing back and saying, well, we're going to put tariffs on you. This is crazy, right? But it
well,
was almost inevitable.
Yeah.
It was almost inevitable just because of how big the US had got and other countries were growing up.
So let's perhaps summarize this in the following way. There have been many challenges with the way that the US has managed its global economic relationships, which have created opportunities for China to step in. And certainly here in Singapore, I'm very conscious of that. Furthermore, the strategy that China has pursued, which many people would call mercantilism kind of on steroids, is one that has been pursued by many growing powers. The US in the 19th century, who stole patents, primarily using capital from Europe to build the infrastructure, which built their railways, which built their steel industry, and so on and so forth. So do we have a right to complain? Well, we'll come to that in a second, but the effect of that, the impact of that politically has been that there's been a huge loss of jobs in the US. People who control companies and wealth have made an absolute fortune because the globalist model that's allowed jobs to be exported has basically increased the margins for many, many, many key products, which have made companies richer, but they haven't made the working man richer. And that's in a way at the center of the divisiveness that we currently see in US politics, where people can barely talk to one another. Is it fair? Is it fair, do you think, to say that, Gary?
No, I do. And it was, many a book which was written about a decade ago that all this technology would allow people to put their feet up and not have to work. That's not happened. The only people putting their feet up are not necessarily working are the people that own the capital, not the labor, right?
Yeah,
So
well,
it's this constant exploitation of labor, which doesn't go away, even though we talk about modern times.
I mean that I noticed Barack Obama just suddenly decided that AI was going to cause a loss of job. I don't know who poked him, but I've been trying for a long time, as you probably have, to point out to people there's this strange notion abroad, and there has been for a long time, that automation, AI, whatever it is, yes, it will deprive people of jobs, but there'll always be other jobs created. Well, actually, that's completely illogical, because if you replace 10 people with a machine or one person, and you do that on a massive scale over a long period, then quite clearly a lot of people are not going to have jobs, particularly people who do not have the ability to adapt to a high technology environment, which is about 15% of the workforce based on statistics. Yeah. So
Agreed.
alienation of the workforce, loss of jobs, that's where we find ourselves. And the other thing that I think has to be said is that both political parties in the US, and to some extent the whole political establishment in Europe, have really backed this globalism approach, irrespective of the damage that it's done to the middle and working classes. Is that fair?
Well, I think globalism, and I remember, when the Berlin Wall came down and we had an integrated Europe, so when we're actually all talking to each other and all working with each other, this global thing can be very, very positive. But where it just allows for greater exploitation of people, and I think that's probably where where this argument is landing, that's wrong. And so to just counter something you said about people being employed, it's just about how effectively they're employed, because the US has seen it to be at full employment. Are people happy? No.
And they're
So
all
we've
on
got to
minimum
create
wage
not just
jobs delivering
that's
burgers,
right.
right? Yeah.
And living on the edge. Yeah. Living to
Uh,
work is a comment I keep
which
hearing.
I know I'm not
Oh,
allowed that, which Trump brilliantly parodied during his election campaign by going to a McDonald's and handing out burgers,
yeah.
um, because an awful lot of people work in McDonald's. I guess it's, probably millions worldwide, but so that's brilliant. So there we are. So we have divided society, we have jobs moving abroad, we have an elite at the top of society in an unhealthy relationship with politicians of both parties, making lots and lots and lots of money, while everyone else sees a distinct decline in their living standards.
Good summary.
Okay, well that takes us really to the second part: is enter one Donald Trump. Stage left. Now we could go back to Trump's first term because he's been saying the same things actually for quite a long time. I mean, in the early 2000s, he was talking about the fact that China was robbing America blind and he needed to do something about it. Why didn't he deal with that in his first term, do you think, Gary?
Yeah, he probably didn't know how to do it, and he didn't. And he also had, and again, I'm putting up not necessarily an argument I would make, but the argument that was made or an excuse that was provided was that he basically had establishment characters around him in his
Yeah,
first term.
they made
So
sure that
every
they
time,
were the minders because he didn't have a
that's
team
right.
to go. He didn't have a team to go in with, so he lent on everyone. Said, "Oh, I need a team." They all said, "Oh, we'll help you." And of course, they were all handpicked individuals to ensure that the status quo remained as much as possible unchallenged.
Yes, and very much they just didn't want the disruption that he was committing to.
Well, we seem to have it now.
In buckets.
Yes. So right, so you give us your view of. I mean, I have to say, I'm having immense fun. I mean, now does this mean I'm cruel? I don't know, but I find Trump's a lot more fun than the previous fellow who could barely stand up. I mean, 3 hour press conferences, going at everybody. I mean, you got to admire the man. So or not, as the case may be, since a lot of people seem to hate it. So what do you make of that? He was very fast out of the
Well,
gate. What do you make of that?
well, the first thing to say is they voted for it. Secondly, is they weren't listening, because is he doing something different from what he promised? No. Did people understand the consequences of what he was promising? No. The third thing is, obviously, he's not the best communicator. So, and ruffling feathers. And when you're in that leadership role, you've got to provide an environment of confidence, irrespective if you're going to take, quite frankly, people off the edge of a cliff. You should do it in a nice way. So we're getting all the disruption without a clear direction. And I have to say, Simon, this is the first time in my life that I wake up like everyone else do, and we're only thinking about one human being in the world. And that is scary.
It's interesting. I must have attained a higher plane of existence because I mean I don't have that worry at all. The the communication style, just ignoring all the lies about it. The communication style is from the building industry in New York. I mean, that's the reality, right? Where I mean, you've been to New York, as I have. People are incredibly direct, incredibly rude, and when you're aggressive and rude, people kind of like that. His book, The Art of the Deal, which I quoted on the BBC more times than I care to mention because they all sniff at it and won't read it. It says exactly what he's doing, which is that when you want to change something in a big way, you lay down a massive challenge, which is going to scare the pants off absolutely everybody because it's so extreme. You get them sort of frightened and on edge, and then you engage with them, and then you strike a deal which is somewhere in the middle, which works out well for both parties. I mean, that's what he's doing, isn't it?
That's what he promised. Although, no, sorry, I don't think he even promised that. No, let me get it right, because I listened to Kevin McCarthy speak here in Dubai about 4 months ago, and he said exactly that. He said, "Don't worry, you know, his bark is stronger than his bite,
Yeah.
and when it comes to the final deal, it'll be a lot softer." The problem is the negotiation is killing the world at the moment
Mhm.
because we're running in fear. So when people talk about growth, I've just seen some forecasts. We have a US economy that, these very broad group of economists are now saying we will have something like 1 to 1.5% growth in the US this year and next year and into the future because of what he's doing. So when we actually, we've got nothing to tell us that isn't going to be the case at the moment because we haven't seen a compromise. And maybe it's early days, but we must see compromises. We must see a 50-50 outcome as
Yeah.
opposed to 100% I'm right.
I mean, we live in a. I mean, I have a slightly more confidence. I We live in a world where we are constantly encouraged to worry. It just seems to be the job of the media. Even entities that used to be respectable, like the BBC, have gone from a sort of anodyne commentary on what's going on to a 10 reasons today why you should be terrified. It's Trump, it's the climate, it's the Middle East, it's whatever. I choose not to be terrified, and I do remind myself, and you may disagree with that. First of all, the fact that he's had to move so fast is a function, first of all, of what happened in his first term, and secondly, the fact that he's only got 18 months before the midterms. That's now 15 months. And there's every possibility that he might lose control of one or both parts of Congress. And if he does, it's going to become almost impossible for him to do anything. So the political environment in the US, in my view, could be said to be constraining him to a very, very aggressive approach to this. He needs to set things up so that they'll work through incredibly fast. And I think the other thing is people are interpreting changes and nuances as sort of failures and backing down. And what's happening is a negotiation, isn't it? I mean, you've negotiated big contracts, and so have I. We don't tell people what's an acceptable outcome at the beginning. What we do is we make a big demand, in a slightly politer way than Trump has, to be perfectly honest. And then we basically trade around the edges until we end up with something that both parties. He seems to get criticised for not making it clear what he wants, which I find an extraordinary demand. I mean, who on earth would do that at the beginning of a major? And there seem to be a lot of people who say it's bound to end in catastrophe. Is there any circumstance, Gary, where you can see this not ending in a dramatic catastrophe and massively reduced growth?
Well, I still live in the hope of what you've just articulated, that he's there for a deal, is not to take us off the edge of the cliff. So if there is the problem is we have not yet got one example of a deal being done. We need a
Rumor has it the
compromise.
Japanese are about to ink one.
That's
But
right.
yeah,
But that was the rumor last Friday as well. That was going to
yeah.
happen on Sunday. So
There's another
yeah, we
rumor
do.
that the Japanese are absolutely scandalized and will never talk to him again. So I don't really know who to believe. Yeah.
That's right. So this is the problem. The problem is we only have bad news at the moment. We've only got the first with the opening salvo without reply. We don't have a compromise. We don't have some measure of the degree to which he's going to back down from his original proposal. If we had that, we would not be in a situation where the gold price is up 35%
Yeah.
since the beginning of the year, where
Well,
forecasts for inflation are at 5% now as opposed to the 2% we had before. And crucially, and I think this is really important, he's not just doing this tariff thing. The Supreme Court judgment that put him in this omnipotent position has him actually not even fearing the midterms. He doesn't fear anyone, and that's the concern in
well, they
markets.
did try and shoot his head off. I mean, he's a brave man. They call him everything under the sun, but the fact of the matter is, he's got enormous courage. And I don't think he's that stupid either. So, here I am apologizing. Why do I have to keep apologizing? Because everyone hates him so much. All my liberal friends are dumping me. I had two people leave my network the other day, and they sort of were smiling and everything. Then I heard secondhand, we can't possibly belong to a network with a man like Simon who thinks that Donald Trump, could be could be sensible, actually have a policy, Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I choose to remain positive. I think one area that concerns me a lot, because he has a certain style and is, in my view, the New York building site style, primarily. And I think you can just about get away with that when you're dealing with direct people. I mean, even a German or a Dutchman or a Brit we can deal with directness to a degree. People who can't deal with directness are many cultures in Asia who never deal with directness. And my experience, and I learned this early on, and I've been here for more than 30 years. I think you've probably been even here even longer. If you cause personal offense or you cause someone to lose face as they perceive it, they'll never talk to you again, ever. I mean, is there a sense in which there's a risk that President Xi would rather his entire nation went off a cliff than that he would actually go back to Trump and eat crow in order to get a deal? I mean, what do you think about that?
I think so. I mean, I think, it's like the Chinese talk in thousands of years, not thousands of minutes. That's a huge change, a difference.
Yeah,
The Chinese do not forget. I'm not saying just the Chinese. I don't think there's a lot of cultures out there
yeah,
who will not forget when someone makes a statement which drags down a nation. And the Chinese have come from off the floor through cheap manufacturing now to a significant amount of intellect in the way in which they put products and
yeah,
services together. And they want to be recognized for what they are. If someone just said, you know what, these are good guys. These are guys make good stuff. I mean, that is what
yeah,
the Xi Jinping wants to hear, and
yeah.
not the kind of rhetoric that he gets. So I said it's the antagonism which is multiplying this crisis at the
But that,
moment, and it
that
just needs to
that's a
calm down.
that's a cultural
It's,
antagonism. Uh, you
absolutely.
know, I mean, I grew up on a farm, and the language was blue, and people came to blows. I mean, and somehow things were resolved. It was a culture. You go to a university. See, the reason I'm not entirely opposed to this directness is because I look at modern politicians. I look at the Tony Blairs of this world. I look at the Barack Obamas of this world. Astonishingly smooth, wonderful rhetoric, charm the hind legs of a donkey. But in terms of policy, in terms of what they've actually delivered, fundamentally untrustworthy and wrong, in my view, ideologically wrong and greatly damaging to both economies. You may not agree with that, but I'd rather. So where I end up is I'd rather have somebody that's a bit crass and a bit plain spoken, who's kind of going in the wrong direction, and the Trump team constantly talk about a return to common sense, than someone who is mellifluous, charming, but is leading us completely down the garden path.
I push back a bit in one very crucial point. The US, whoever the president is of the United States, they have a certain responsibility because you are the largest economy in the world. You have already made it to the top of the tree. So please treat everyone else with a little bit of respect, and don't in a sense use that power or abuse that power in your negotiations. So being rough and ready, fine. But listen, I think you've got to be a bit diplomatic when you've already made it to the top of the tree.
Yeah, I always said to my children, my beautiful children, who are both adults now and charming adults, I always said, no matter whom you meet, always give them a little bit more than they expect, because that's the way to make the world. I don't think Donald Trump was ever told that by Fred Trump. He's a different character altogether. But I want to, in a minute, I want to come to the question of what might happen next as sort of the third part of this discussion. So we agree that Trump has really upset the apple cart. He's got politicians all over the world scurrying around wondering what on earth is going on. Yeah. Um, I want to put it to you that if you're educated and you look back at history, when you want things to change in a very significant way, it requires an individual who doesn't conform. In other words, nobody from the normal mold of Democrat or Republican politics could ever have attempted what Trump is attempting to do now, whether it goes wrong or it doesn't go wrong. And if you look back at history, and I'm talking about good and bad, people have come out of the background, and they tended to be very controversial people who were very often quite widely hated. Churchill was massively hated, by both sides of the house because he wasn't faithful to anything. Um, Whoever it is. So I'm sort of slightly playing devil's advocate here and saying you need someone that is rough and ready, that's prepared to break things in order to make substantive changes to the model. Of course, if you don't think the changes are needed, then that's a worry. But if you do, and you've got a totally corseted political system as you have in the US, how do you achieve major change without having a breaker, a disruptive individual like a Trump? Can you think of another
Yeah.
way? Because I can't.
Um, no, and I think part of the problem is where Trump, in a sense, found himself. He's picked this thing up called the US, right? He's just a random politician who's come in and said, "Okay, I'm going to do it in the US." The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is the US is so into the fabric of the whole world, right? It has gunboats in China seas. It has agreements, military agreements with most of the West. It has, and because of that scale, you can't just turn around and say, we're not going to do this anymore, because the world was never prepared and ready for the US saying, we're going to go home with our cricket bat and ball and we're never going to play with you again. And that's in essence the shock that the world's woken up to. Now, so a couple of things. How do we work our way out of this? Firstly, it can't just be about the US. And I wrote a note just 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, called "A Silver Lining in the Storm," which is to say, okay, world, wake up.
Can we share that
US.
with our listeners, Gary? Because I'm sure they're going to want to.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
I'll
And
tag
the
that,
point I
folks.
make is Europe, China, you need to spend more money in the shops, right? Your consumers have to be encouraged and have confidence. Europe, get off your deathbeds, get working, and take down all of the regulations which are stopping you from growing. And, and into Asia, kind of get over it and start working together as a region, as opposed to being expecting the US to pay for everything. And I'm really making it very simple.
But no, I agree with all of that, but I just don't see any policy. I mean, if you look at what's actually happening in politics in Europe, Le Pen, who said some of the things that you've just said, although in different language, in French, they've tried to get her arrested, much as they did to Trump, so that she can't actually take her place in politics, despite the fact that she got, more votes than anyone else. Same things happen in Germany, where the AfD, the Conservative Party, who campaigned on dealing with immigration, which is a huge issue, has made an alliance, with the Socialist Party and completely compromised on all their immigration promises, rather than do a deal with the AfD, which people keep calling hard right, but actually it's not. It's just what the Conservatives were, 30 years ago. Rather than do a deal with them, it's completely collapsed its view on what. I just think that the intellectual elite in Europe is completely pusillanimous, with the honourable exception of the gorgeous Giorgia Meloni, of whom I am an absolutely huge admirer. I mean, I think she's absolutely lovely. She should definitely be in charge of a lot of things, not just Italy. But apart from her, I don't see any nous. I don't see any independence. I see the same kind of global liberalist thinking that's got us into this mess continuing. Can you point to, perhaps with the exception perhaps of some countries in Eastern Europe?
No, I mean, we could go through the list. We could go through the list, but at the end of the day, I think the pressure is going to be so intense that even someone who's, just thinks they can wait till next year or the year after will realize, no, you have to do it now, because your unemployment rate's going to go up. You're going to be dysfunctional. You've lost one of the key stakes, the key known points in your economy that's not working for you anymore. So I think there will be a reaction. Indeed, to your point, it took Europe 20 years to agree a trade deal with Latin America, which was inked at the beginning of this year. And now people are just screaming, well, let's get on with it. This is one of the largest consumer markets in combination, with a great opportunity. So I do think something will emerge, a bit like saying Donald Trump might just calm down and do a deal. It's the same in Europe, not just doing a deal, but actually getting up and changing your economy and applying yourselves, getting the growth going again.
I don't know who it would be that would lead that in any of the major economies, based on the current political leadership. I mean, I agree with you. It's absolutely. Perhaps you and I need to go back and live in Europe and take charge of all that, Gary. Because
shake the tree.
shake the tree. Yes. Yeah. That's really interesting. Well, let's. I'm gonna pause for a moment, to offer a little commercial to our growing Raffles crew. And I really am very glad to have the opportunity to talk to Gary Dugan, CEO CEO of the CIO office, whose global knowledge and experience is absolutely critical for me and for Raffles Crew members in understanding what's going on, not just in the context of the US tariffs, and aren't they fun, but in all the other things that are going on in Asia. And one of the things we've talked about, Gary, is that on a quarterly basis, we'll maybe have you work through some forecast numbers, so that we can basically go through them with Raffles Crew members. And I'm hoping that you and I can talk about getting that up and running.
Absolutely. And I look forward to it, because this is a time when people need a clear understanding of what the world's, how it's changing and evolving. With more knowledge
So
is better knowledge.
so watch this space, crew members. You're going to get the answers that you need. And Gary and I will work on that. We'll have something for you in the next few weeks. So the final part of this is, how is it going to play out? Okay. Can we see this working out for the benefit of all concerned?
But balance of risk at the moment, no. As I said, because I've yet to see that little edge of compromise from Donald Trump, and we went into this crisis, unfortunately, with people with too much leverage in portfolios and in their daily lives,
Yeah.
too much sitting back and feeling very relaxed. And we have now got to stand up, we've got to rebuild, and we've got to move on, and we've got to move on with a completely different economic model for the world. Because as I said, even if there's elections in 18 months from now in the US, I think Donald Trump continues. The US will be looking after the US. The rest of the world will have to get off its sofa and look after itself. And that will be a big transformation.
Well, that's a shock that was needed, really, because certainly the US in terms of defense, sorry, the Europeans in terms of defense, in terms of other things, have really been, very weak and very pusillanimous, and they need to pull themselves together. But based on their responses to Trump pushing the Ukraine towards a peace, those responses from Europe, that is, are absolutely delusional. They're delusional. The military aspirations, and that we're going to put, $5 trillion into defense expenditure, and we're going to have an army, and we're going to fight the Russians. I mean, no, it's just not possible, So I'm not seeing that the realism yet of what it would actually take to create an independent European capability, whether it's defense or whether it's building and sustaining industries, or whatever, foreign policy or whatever it is. I'm just not seeing that. So you think that a new generation of political leaders will emerge?
They will have to be, but unfortunately, you only get these things from crisis, right? So if you look at the rise of Margaret Thatcher, it was because of a crisis. If you look at the changes we've seen politically in countries such as Germany most recently, it's because of a crisis. The dialogue has got to change. It's got to be not that we're thinking about it, but what we're doing about it. The crisis of immigration is a human tragedy, and it's become a greater human tragedy because it wasn't handled properly.
Yeah.
So there has to be much more proactive policy making, and no one can go and hide anymore, because it'll create fewer jobs, we'll have higher inflation, and we're going to have, I don't want to talk about revolution, but the direction of travel is that people get a lot more angrier.
Well, it's certainly, if the ruling establishment clings on to ideas that everyone can see don't work, and prevents populist parties like the AfD, like Marine Le Pen, getting elected, although they're getting the votes. That's very foolish, because it leads to exactly what you described. Let's not conjure up a revolution by talking about it too much, but in reality, democracy is designed for people to be heard. And there now seems to be a very determined movement in Europe to ensure that people are not heard, which I find absolutely terrifying, because I agree with you. I know where it leads. So last 5 minutes, Gary. Can we put any kind of shape around what's going to happen over the next? Well, let's start with the broader future. I mean, this is not the first Trump term, is it? Because he's going to do very well, and we're going to have JD Vance as the next president, aren't we? What do you think?
I'm going to say I hope not.
Okay,
just
really?
given what's happening.
But Gary, he's a wonderful he's a wonderful Catholic boy. So
allegedly.
Okay.
So look, everything's been thrown up in the air. It's a time of turmoil, but from turmoil we hope we get something more positive. And these politicians and leaders have got to turn up. And I'm just in the back of my head as we were speaking, Simon, I'm thinking, you're in Singapore, I'm in Dubai. Quite frankly, I know there's democracy in Singapore. We don't have a democracy here, but we have strong leadership.
Yeah.
And so when we sit here in Dubai and I'm worrying about, I don't look out the window worrying that Dubai is going to end. It isn't going to end because
No.
it knows how to navigate this. And I have to say, the leadership in Singapore made one of the best speeches I've heard about the whole tariff issues and preparing people. People need to work for themselves and work for each other to overcome this. And if we do that, it's just another challenge that we faced in life, and we move on in a positive way.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And, I've lived in Singapore for 32 years, and the longer I've been here and the more dysfunction I've seen in the West, the more I've come to admire the Singapore political system. But let's not pretend that it's an entirely free and fair political system. I don't want to get shot for this, but I probably will. The same party has ruled Singapore since independence, which is 60 years now, more or less. And Lee Kuan Yew, who is one of the great statesmen of the last century, who more than anyone, without whom, and somebody said this to me, without Lee Kuan Yew, she said, Singapore would be nothing. And she's probably right. It's rare for one man to have that degree of influence over a political outcome, but he certainly has. The political and economic outcomes in Singapore today owe an enormous amount to Lee Kuan Yew. And the thing about Lee Kuan Yew was not only was he very smart, he was prepared to completely disregard conventional wisdom on absolutely everything. All the other things that post-colonial countries did because they heard that it was a good idea, he ignored, and he plowed his own furrow. And he famously said, I mean, I suppose I'm countering the kind of democracy will sort it out. He famously said, the notion that you put a whole bunch of people of different religions and beliefs in a room and let them argue it out and they'll come up with a useful consensus which they'll all follow is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, that was his view. His view was, it's a sort of almost a Platonic view, the Plato's Republic, where you have a small gang of guardians who are experts trained. It's up to a bunch of clever people to come up with the right policies and to lead everyone. I don't know where that leads us, but we certainly haven't got that in the West. So I'm an appreciator of firm government. I'm an appreciator of no crime. I'm an appreciator of no drugs. I'm an appreciator of how my children were educated in this country. So I think the West should come here and have a very good look at how things work in Singapore and see if they can't take it back to Europe with them. That's what I think.
Agreed. It needs fresh ideas and it needs the right leadership, and we don't have those in place at this point in time in many parts of the world.
You're a very wise man, Gary, and you've been guiding my thoughts now for a number of years, and we share other things as well, and including an abiding faith, and I think that's really important. But can you summarize? Can you find something positive in a Trump-led world to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, the first few minutes of the day, I wake up and I feel pretty miserable, and I think about all of the challenges at hand. But then you say, this is a time for leadership. This is a time to stand up, put fresh ideas out there, and move forward in a positive way and say, look, I've got challenges, but I'm going to do something about it. And I'm going to do something about it that is helpful to the greater good than just myself. And I think if everyone were to apply themselves to that, we are going to get to a better place.
Yeah, I mean, I started the Raffles Crew 2 years ago, partly in order for people to take individual responsibility for what's going on. So love ourselves and others, help each other with our career in a way which is based on trust and support without expectation, and try and care about our world, and not in a grandiose way where we glue ourselves to paintings in order to change the movement of the planets, but practical things we can do on a day-to-day basis. And I'm sorry, I slightly gave away my perspectives there, but at the end of the day, I think we need more personal responsibility and less beefing, and with that, I'm going to give a very, very, very big thanks to Gary. Gary, thank you for putting up with my wacky ideas and for lending your much saner analysis to this discussion on Donald Trump.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks, Gary.